Today we're going to tie a little classic fly called the woolly worm. It's kind of like a woolly bugger pattern, very similar, just has a little shorter tail. We're going to tie it in black and red, which is a classic color. First thing we're going to do is start off with some 025 lead wire in a Tiemco 5262 or a 5263 streamer hook. Then we're just going to wrap it around most of the shank. Then we're going to take our thread and just wrap through that wire, making sure it's not going to go anywhere. I usually just wrap through it a few times. It doesn't have to be pretty. It just has to be secure and cover the majority of the wire up. Don't want that wire slipping around on us. Now the next thing we're going to do is tie in our tail. For that I'm going to use a little bit of red Marabou. And it doesn't really matter what kind of Marabou you use. Either extra select or woolly bugger Marabou is fine. And you can see here it has nice kind of fine tips at the tip. We want to pluck all those out, kind of the opposite of what you would do with the woolly bugger. So I just take the tips and just take my finger and my fingernails and pull them all kind of to a nice blunt end. Kind of the opposite of what you would do with the woolly bugger or any other streamer. The woolly worm kind of has a blunt, short tail. And that's what I'm going for, is a little short, blunt tail. And you can trim it with scissors, but I kind of like these rough edges. I don't like a nice clean cut on my woolly worms. It looks a little fishier when you get these kind of little blunt tails. And I want it to be about a third of the length of the shank of the hook. I want it to be pretty short. So I'm just going to take that in. Trim some of it out of my way there. I'm just going to tie that in right here at the back. A few wraps. You can always adjust after you make your first few wraps. And tie it in with that nice short tail. Trim out the excess. And just wrap through it a couple more times. Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to tie in our ribbing wire. Now you could tie a woolly worm a few different ways. The technique we're going to use today, we're going to be tying it with the hackle kind of facing backwards. So you can see that hackle kind of lays back. The other way you can tie it is with the hackle facing forward. So the curve of the feather, all the hackle faces forward. And some guys will tie it in here at the back and wrap it forward. But I like my hackle to lay back, kind of similar to a woolly bugger. I like all the hackle to lay back on the fly, kind of in the direction that you're stripping the fly. Personal preference, there's two different ways you can tie it. Today we're going to be tying it kind of what I call woolly bugger style, with that hackle facing back. So for that technique we're going to use a little bit of copper wire here. You can either use small or brassy. I'm going to use some small. We're going to tie it in just along the side of the shank of the hook, kind of as we go back down the fly all the way to the tail. Now we're ready for the body. Now a lot of guys will use medium chenille for the body. I find on a woolly worm it just builds up a little too fast. I like to use fine chenille and lightly overlap it as I wrap. So the fine chenille is just a little smaller. You can get a little bit more control with the fine chenille and get a little more of an even body rather than getting a body with some lumps and bumps in it. So I'm just going to take that chenille, tie it in at the back, then I'm going to wrap forward all the way to where my lead is. I'm going to take the chenille and just work forward on the body with it. Each wrap I put kind of right up against each other, slightly overlapping. You can see how nice and smooth I can get a body to be here. And Once I get up to the eye, I can just capture the chenille. Trim it out of there. And there I have a nice smooth woolly worm body. The next step we're going to do is we're going to tie in the hackle. So I've plucked a nice long grizzly feather here. And I'm just going to roughly measure it out. I want my hackle to reach down past, you can also measure it back here, I want it to reach down past the hook point at the head of the fly, and then it'll kind of taper back as we wrap it forward. So I just pluck a few of the fibers away from the stem here. I want to tie this in so that the curve of the feather lays back onto the body of the fly. Tie it in, then I'm going to take one entire wrap around the front of the fly, and then once I do that, I'm just going to angle it back and work the hackle through the fly. I want nice large spiraling wraps on this fly. And then once you get to the back, you can take your wire. Basically I'm going to wrap through all these spiraling wraps the opposite way going forward with this wire. Basically I'm counter wrapping here. I can kind of wiggle the wire a little bit as I work my way through. That'll help not trap some of those hackles. And I'll pop out here by the head. Once I do that, I can capture that wire. I will usually kind of spiral it out of there. That way I don't have to trim it with my scissors. Trim that extra stem there. Now I'm just going to lay down a few wraps. I'm just going to wrap back up onto the hackle that we wrapped just ever so slightly. This is going to help it lay back. Then you can sneak in here, try not to trim any of the other hackles, and trim out the rest of your hackle there. And if you have a few stray little fibers on your tail, you can trim those out of there. Few little hackle tips facing the wrong way, so I pluck those out of there. You can whip finish and lay a little bit of gloss head cement on there. That's traditionally what was used back in the day. That is the classic woolly worm pattern. Deadly little fly for trout, and also bluegill and bass. I used to use this on small farm ponds when I was a kid for bluegill. I used to catch some monster bluegill on the woolly worm. Another good color is light olive grizzly along with that red tail, but black was always one of my favorite colors. That is the classic woolly worm.